Muller says that he induced point mutations. Now, he introduces the term because he's really trying to emphasize, I'm special. He knows if he gets the discovery, he's going to get the big prize at some point. And in fact, when Muller publishes his paper in Science, which is still the big journal, Muller never shows any data.
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelley Lesher. Today we are discussing the linear non-threshold model of radiation, also known as the LNT, with Dr. Edward Calabrese, a professor of environmental health sciences at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He has extensively researched a variety of areas in toxicology, risk assessment, environmental health, and hormesis, but our main interest is in dose response. Particularly the hubris of one man, Hermann Mueller, and how decades after his work has been debunked, it continues to influence environmental and nuclear policy. You don't need to completely understand the LNT to understand the story that Ed tells. And Ed does know what he's talking about. He has written hundreds of peer-review papers on the subject. So I want to start at the beginning. What is LNT? What does it stand for, and what is it?
So the question is, what is LNT? The LNT stands for the linear non-threshold dose response. And it's a dose-response relationship, a dose-response mathematical function that indicates that the response is directly proportional to the dose. As the dose goes up, the response goes up directly with the increase in the dose, and it will decrease. The response will decrease in direct proportion to the dose, and there's no stopping the decrease until you get to zero. That's really what is the crucial aspect of LNT, such that if you have a chemical that causes cancer, then in theory, that there is a risk of cancer down to a single molecule, and the risk only goes away when in fact the molecule goes away. You might think as a child you might have puffed on a cigarette 2 times when you were 13 years old. Did that increase your cancer as 1 puff? Well, according to LNT, yes, it would, even if it might not be ever measurable by epidemiologic methods and things of that nature. And it gets transposed over to, in fact, the world of radiation, where you measure exposures with respect to ionizations, and you go down to a single ionization. And in the world of, we're exposed to so many ionizations every day. Billions, trillions, you can't count them. But in theory, and if you look at the original literature, people who were working in this area, they talk about going down to single ionizations, things of that nature, in a very hypothetical sort of a way that they couldn't. And they got into lots of discussions, debates, mathematical evaluations as to numbers of ionizations, cancers, and so forth. It's a bit like trying to figure out how many angels can fit in the head of a pin, that sort of thing. Very, very hypothetical, unresolvable, mathematical, and yet detached from the reality that we live in many ways.
So is LNT, is this dose response, is this unique to radiation, or is it used in other fields as well, or in other situations?
Well, it started with radiation, put it that way. And in fact, in the world of chemical toxicology, I'll say pharmacology, then chemical toxicology, they actually started with a threshold model. They believed that there were levels of exposure that were low enough so as to not evoke any biological response. That would kind of be lost in the background of just background living, background noise, as we might call it. And then when you go past a certain threshold, you generate either an adaptive response or a toxic response, but somehow you've agitated the cell to respond. It's tripped a wire. And most people who have consumed alcohol in their life, they've experienced feeling of a high, a lightheadedness. Well, if you've either consumed alcohol too quickly or too much of it. And so even the rules of the game, the driving and alcohol consumption game, it's really based on a threshold. And in my work, I deal with low doses, and I'd have to tell you that below the alcohol threshold for adversely affecting your driving, there's actually a stimulation in the capacity of the body to have improved perception, improved performance. This is not addressed within regulation. Regulation's looking at higher doses. That low dose stimulation is an example of what I call hormesis, which is another dose response, which is different than the linear dose response, and where it indicates totally different situation where you can't predict it from high doses what goes on at low doses. It's in the hormetic one, you might have a low dose at some point may induce a stimulatory response, but at higher doses it induces the opposite, an inhibitory response. And we have in today's world, the world that I live in anyways, it's kind of a discussion, debate over which of these, plus the threshold model, I'll throw those the three big guys, so to speak, which ones best describe the nature of the dose response in the low dose zone. And just for the audience sake, I'm a strong proponent of the hormetic dose response and have been for an awful long time. I'd have to say that the last 12 years or so, I've other than the science of it all, I had to get into the history of it all. And I had to become like a historian.
Well, and that's where our podcast comes in, right? So that's what we're interested in, is that intersection of history and science that I find extremely interesting because science doesn't live in a vacuum.
No, I'd have to tell you that in the classroom, I'm not sure people who would agree with this, because I was always taught by people who stayed close to the book, and then the book was a straight line. This is how the science is, and man, that's how you learned it. In my classes, I totally changed over time, and I began to see science as biography. And it's really trying to study how ideas developed in these leaders and which ideas they had and how the ideas in their minds were competitive and struggled and why certain ideas rose to the top and others were put to the side. And I also came to the conclusion that sometimes these leading lights, they chose the wrong idea. And it was important to go back in and dig this out. And actually, that made it much more real and dynamic and at the same time messy, because what it does is it makes you question everything.
And science is about questioning, and science is about looking back and making sure that we took the right turn. So let's go to one of these stories, and let's go to Hermann Muller in 1926, who claims that genetic mutation in fruit flies introduced by X-rays. And this is kind of the start of LNT. So why is this the start of LNT, and why is this an important discovery?
Well, okay, it's an important discovery, but not really for risk assessment purposes. It was back in the day when Muller was, now about 26, he does his first big experiment and gets the first evidence, and he publishes his paper in Science in 1927. But Muller was on the hunt for mutation ever since he was a graduate student, starting around 1911 with his advisor at Columbia. They were interested in trying to come up with what was the underlying mechanism of biological evolution. This was really the big question. There was Darwin's Origin of the Species in 1859. There was Gregor Mendel's work that followed after that with distribution of chromosomes and genes through sexual reproduction. But they really didn't have understanding of novelty and how it was selected for and how it was mediated through genes and so forth. And so they were really looking to see, how did we get all this novelty here on Earth? It wasn't through sexual reproduction. We needed some other, sexual reproduction plays a role in this, but we needed a basis for mutation. They understood genes, and they were coming to understandings of how genes are aligned on chromosomes and the concept and everything. But they were trying to figure this out, and they had a serious problem. And the problem was they were working with fruit flies because they were a nice research vehicle. They could reproduce quickly, produce many. They had traits that could be followed, visual traits that could be followed. But the problem with the fruit fly and the problem with mutation and all that Muller was going through, and that is that he and others claim that in the course of the first, let's say decade or so of this serious research, they had looked at collectively maybe 20 to 25 million fruit flies, however they estimated that.
How do you count 25 million fruit flies?
Maybe it's like the fish story. I caught my fish, it's so big, that sort of thing.
Gotcha. Okay.
But So they knew that they had seen many thousands and thousands and thousands, and they probably just aggregated it and were way off by. They could have been off by plus or minus 20 million. Who knows how much they were off by, right? But they knew they had looked at gigantic numbers of fruit flies. Put it that way, gigantic, and they repeat this 20 to 25 million, but they were very specific when they said, and all we have seen in these and over these years is because they documented these through publications was about 400 visual mutations. They knew, and they had tried to induce mutations in every which single way. I mean, they used radon, they used X-rays, they used the most toxic chemicals you could possibly use. They heated them up, they cooled them down, they did everything nasty to these fruit flies that you could possibly do. And actually, they were unable to induce mutation in any single experiment that they had. So what happened was they're scratching their heads as to, if we can't induce mutation and we are really trying to induce mutation, then how does nature induce mutation? I mean, we're here. We believe in evolution. How does it all work?
So they're using all of this. They're using all this radiation to try to simulate evolution.
Well, in a way, they try any which way that they can. It's really just as even a first start to see, well, we know that nature is working through these chromosomes, and we know that we have to, alter the gene, but we really can't alter that. We've tried, and we really can't alter the gene, but they all know that this is how it has to work. They just haven't figured out how to do it yet. And so, it's 1910, 1911, and Muller gets his PhD. He's here and there. It's now 1926, and there are different groups looking at it and trying to get to it. And one of their real problems was that they really couldn't figure out what was a real treatment effect versus what was normal variability. That was the big stumbling block.
Well, I mean, 400 out of 26 million does not seem like a very large number at all. That seems like normal variation.
That's right. And so Muller decided he was going to try, 15 years later, he came up with an idea, and he was going to try to make it simple, stupid. And so he then used what's called a sex-linked trait methodology that was linked to important genes that could lead to mortality. And so if you could induce mutation, it would only show up in, let's say, in the male offspring, like we have sex-linked traits that lead to color blindness and things that are carried on our X chromosome, but the Y chromosome is short and doesn't have two genes for that particular trait. So if you have a mutation on the X chromosome, you don't have a second gene to balance it off and protect yourself from the adverse effect. And so they used this method, and they wanted to come up with something that would be at least definitive that a mutation could, in fact, evoke death. And we could actually count death, and we didn't have to argue about whether the mutation was real or not, as compared to looking at, variability in wing formation or the size of the antenna or whatever might be going on within the insect. And so Muller did that, but Muller, he was following the research of others who were in this area trying to still induce changes. These fruit flies, as great as they were for studying traits, they were pretty difficult for inducing genetic changes in. And there was a guy at Union College in Schenectady, New York. His name was Mavor, and he was looking at this phenomenon called crossing over, which is not really gene mutation, but exchanging broken chromosome parts between adjacent chromosomes. And it's an important genetic phenomenon. But he was able to induce this, and he could double the rate of it. But he could only do this by giving a dose that would result in the sterilization of about 90% of his subjects. It was an extremely high dose rate, put it that way. And so Muller, when he began his experiments, he adopted the high dosing strategy of this guy Mavor from Union College. And Muller was using a dose rate that was about 100 million times greater than background rate. 100 million. And that was his low dose rate.
His low dose was 100 million times background?
Yeah, his low dose rate. So I'll emphasize rate.
Low dose rate. Okay. That's significant.
Yeah, it's very significant. And just like what happened to Mavor's research, Muller killed a lot of his little fruit flies, and he made many sterilized. Some obviously lived through it because there's variability in how things happen anyways. So some survived to contribute to his experiments, but it's pretty massive. But he was able to because he was looking at a very defined trait, not variability of some of these continuous traits. He was looking at death or living. That he had something now that was very definitive that radiation could induce mutation. But it was really very skewed in an unusual way towards extremely high doses. But Muller, what he did, he was so overjoyed with the fact that he actually induced mutations. He was just a little kid in a candy store. And I have nice letters from him to some of his colleagues showing how excited he was. Nobody else could see this. His language is like a little kid who hits their first home run in Little League. It was just a very excited, you could see Muller was childlike in his excitement. It was nice to see.
But the guy in Union College had already done it.
No, he did crossing over. He hadn't actually looked at genetic traits. But I'd have to tell you, the guy at Union College tried to, him and Muller really duked it out over who was first, that sort of thing. They gave it to Muller over this other guy, but the guy was pushed back pretty strongly in letters to colleagues. Muller was always concerned that Mavor was going to steal his glory and things of that nature. This is part of the human process, right?
Okay, so Muller has this home run. He has extremely high dose rate. A bunch of his fruit flies die. They get sterilized, but he's finally induced mutation. But at this time in 1927, he's convinced he has a mutation.
Well, that's the interesting thing, is that when Muller writes his paper, because Muller knew that other people had seen transgenerational phenotypic changes. They had seen, because you could blast chromosome and knock it around, you could get chromosomes break and they recombine, and some of those traits can be changed, and you can see those in the next generation, but it's not considered significant in a major biological sense. You really have to have these little micro mutations that Muller thinks is how evolution works. It's not through pulverizing the system like Mavor did or something along those lines. And so Muller, when he writes his paper, he calls it the artificial transmutation of the gene. He's emphasizing the gene. Now, Muller has a close friend whose name is Edgar Altenberg, who's also a Columbia PhD, does his, radiation genetics and the like. Very, very close friends from high school all the way through until the end of their lives. They were born about the same year and died within months of each other. Always close communication. I have letters between them and so forth. And Edgar writes to Muller and he says, Herman, how do you know that you just didn't punch big holes in these chromosomes? How do you know? You're claiming Muller, in his paper in Science, Muller says that he induced point mutations. Now, he introduces the term because he's really trying to emphasize, I'm special. He knows if he gets the discovery, he's going to get the big prize at some point down the road. So he creates the term point mutation. And so he said, how do you know you haven't confused a mechanism with an observation? So, in fact, when Muller publishes his paper in Science, which is still the big journal, Muller never shows any data. I mentioned earlier that I've been 0 for 70, maybe 77 in my attempts to get papers in Science. Muller, in this paper in Science, and then the biggest arena with the biggest topic of the day, makes a big claim and doesn't show any data. He discusses what he claims are his data.
That doesn't make sense to me because big claims require big proof. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And you're saying this is an extraordinary claim. So where's the extraordinary evidence?
Well, that became an issue. And it's complicated because I've had this issue. How did Muller get his paper in Science without any data? With the biggest issue, how would somebody even permit this to take place? And did his data ever go through peer review? And how did it stack up? And did they ever answer Edgar Altenberg's question of how do you know you weren't punching holes in the chromosomes? And actually, all this stuff comes back to haunt Muller and his story.
Well, so we are still, though, on Muller's rise in our history. So Muller is living high, right? He has point mutations, or so he claims. And we're going to skip ahead to the biggest prize. So Muller does get the biggest prize, which is the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1946. This is a little bit of not a straightforward prize, though, right?
Well, let's put it this way. Muller was in a battle to win the prize. And he had opponents. People who, I can't say it, but people who were trying to force him to prove he had that mechanism. And as it turns out, Muller recognized that Altenberg's criticism was real. And Mueller then went into a large-scale research effort to try to prove that, well, yes, I think that I induced gene mutation by trying to then show that the genes were intact and with the radiation he used. And he did this by attempted to do it by studying what he called reverse mutation, that you could take the gene for a red eye and mutate it, and you get a white eye. Then you could take that white eye and then mutate it back to the red eye, go back and forth. He could try to play this sort of a game experimentally. And he was really trying to say that radiation really doesn't destroy the gene. It keeps it intact. It just causes minor changes. And I can go back and forth this way. So he spent a lot of time trying to do this, and he was never successful in doing it. Others did the same thing and tried to in their own way, because this is a real problem. Probably about 12 or so research groups tried it. None of them came out to support Mueller. Mueller couldn't even really support Mueller. And so by the mid-1930s, Mueller was losing ground a lot. According to his biographer, he had come to seriously question whether he had ever induced these gene mutations. And at the same time, I'd have to tell you, when Mueller made his presentation with his data at the Fifth International Radiation Genetics Congress over in Berlin in September of 1927, Mueller presented his data, which were the data that we've talked about with the extremely high dose rates and so forth. But Mueller's paper was never subjected to peer review. It was published in the conference proceedings. And so he avoided peer review at Science. He avoided peer review with the conference proceedings. He really wanted to be first, because being first meant everything. He made the claim. And he had, people at the University of Missouri, Louis Statler was 3 months behind him. And in fact, Statler became the biggest pain for him, because what happened was that Statler had a woman working with him, Barbara McClintock, who was a radiation cytogeneticist, worked with plants. And she looked at Statler's work with corn, and he induced, quote unquote, mutations with high doses in corn. When she looked at his chromosomes with her newly improved cytogenetic staining that had not been applied to the fruit flies at all, but just to the corn, she could tell that Statler's so-called induced gene mutations were really, he was just knocking big holes in his chromosomes and they were recombining. And Statler said, oh my God, if that's happening to me, then that might explain Mueller's data. That's actually what then led to about a 25-year squabble battle on a very high level between Statler and Mueller. And Statler actually ends up winning. In the long run, Statler was able to show that Mueller could not prove his case.
Okay, so hold on. You're telling me that even back in the 20s, Mueller knew that he was wrong. And everything in my field is based on a lie that Mueller knew was wrong, but he wanted the prize. He perpetuated a lie so that he could get fame and glory.
Or a delusion. One can look at it in many different ways.
But even delusion, how can his fame and glory be based on something that wasn't peer reviewed?
I have to tell you that because of that, I went back and I've done, I said, well, maybe there wasn't such a thing as peer review in 1926.
There was peer review in 1926.
I've gone back to the history of peer review, and Mueller's advisor Thomas Hunt Morgan, was one of the leaders in early peer review in the genetics literature. And Mueller was groomed as a graduate student submitting papers to journals that had peer review. And I have lots of evidence that. So Mueller knew the game, and Mueller avoided by playing by the rules. And whereas others played by the rules. And I can also tell you that on two occasions, one was on this. 6 months before, there was a claim of genetic mutation induced in plants by radium by researchers from the New York area, published it in the Proceedings of the National Academy. They claimed gene mutation. Mueller, of course, he cited no references, so he never acknowledged these people, ever. And Mueller had an earlier situation with Kurt Stern, who was then in Germany, dealing with a very significant crossing over and positioning of gene finding. And Kurt Stern was the first to do this, and Mueller kind of did it 3 years later and never cited Kurt Stern's from being first. Muller claimed to be first. Stern finally got courage and challenged Muller, and Muller 6 weeks later writes back to him very apologetically, and then he writes a correction, and Stern let it go away. Muller was a very self-serving individual, and he definitely needed the recognition, the prize. And I would have to tell the audience that, as you said, Muller gets his Nobel Prize 19 years later in 1946. In 1956, Muller actually acknowledges in writing that he did not induce gene mutation. What he was inducing were these large chromosome rearrangements and deletions. But, you don't give your Nobel Prize back.
Well, and at that point, it's too late. The horses are out of the barn, right? Like, he can't stop it at that point.
And Muller's former students and so forth, you'd think they'd have come to the defense of the old man, right? But they didn't. They said, well, actually, Statler was right. Statler was right and Muller was wrong. But Muller was still a great guy. He was a real smart guy. He was a genius in his own right. And it's kind of, they let go what the implications of all this happen to be. Because, and how it relates to the LNT is that we go back to 1927. Muller has his big paper in Science. And then he gets two students to try to do some dose response work. And the dose response work, well, I'm saying that, he was using 100 million times greater than background for dose rate. And he gets students that do about 4 or 5 doses, and they go down to about 30 million times higher dose rate. It's lower, but it's massive. And in these, one of the dissertations, it showed a nice linear dose response. And so Muller, in 1930, based upon this evolution question, plus these data, and that is that Muller was an evolutionist to the core, and Muller realized that the background doesn't induce many mutations. It just doesn't seem to do that. But we need mutations for evolution. And so how is this going to take place? And so Muller, you needed this process. And so we knew that mutations did occur. They just didn't seem to occur very often. And so Muller came to the conclusion that the only way that evolution could take place is that any mutations that did occur could not be repaired. This is like the original sin of Muller, the original sin in the field, that Muller developed the assumption based upon this observation of very few visual mutations with respect to the 20 million, 30 million flies, he says. And so therefore, we have mutations, but those mutations are then subjected to natural selection. The ones that are positive are sustained and move forward. And that's how evolution works. But if we had a repair process to clean these up efficiently, there would be no such thing as evolution. Life would die out. And so that was his first big mistake. And that mistake drove the field. And then when these students did this work in 1927, Muller quickly jumped to the conclusion that the only way we could have evolution was that we had to have a linear dose response all the way down to a single ionization without any repair. And then when 1935, when the very first ever linear non-threshold single-hit model was created, which was mathematically based and the like, it had no repair component to it. And that model was the model that was passed on to the US EPA. When the EPA started in 1970, but they developed their cancer risk assessments around 1975, 1976. And it was really adopting this flawed view of Herman Muller that was passed on over the years directly right to them. And it was applied to chemicals because the thinking at the time was, the mechanism is mediated directly through mutation. And since mutations occur in radiation as well as chemical carcinogens, then we can apply LNT to both domains. And that's why LNT is applied, equally, you might say, to the chemical carcinogen and ionizing radiation domain.
And in fact, we know that there is a mechanism in the human body that cells repair when they're exposed to radiation.
Yeah, and we wouldn't be here today if it hadn't evolved, put it that way. And we have all kinds of repair mechanisms and strategies for dealing with all sorts of molecular stresses and endogenous. We create many of our own stresses endogenously through metabolism as well as externally. And the other thing that was interesting here, and that was that because they developed this idea of background radiation. In 1929, Muller concluded that one of the principal causes of evolution was background radiation. And that's something that has continued all the way to the present time. However, in 1956, this a fellow at the University of California at Berkeley, Harmon, he came up with the idea that metabolism actually generates gigantic amounts of oxygen radicals, gigantic amounts. And these oxygen radicals are the basic cause for aging and perhaps mutation. And by 1962, he had concluded that, in fact, the amount of oxy radicals produced in our normal metabolism outproduces that caused by background radiation by something like 200 million to one, per day in a cell. And in fact, the principal cause of evolution that we generate our background mutations is really through our body. And our body, when you look in the mirror, you say, who's my biggest enemy? My biggest enemy is my own body. It's the basis of why when I'm looking at you and I'm looking at myself here, God, I've lived 77 years, right? And I'm seeing the ravages of time on skin and everything else. And it's due to endogenous metabolism. And the reason why Muller only saw these 400 mutations per 20 million is that our repair capacities are so great. We are causing every day in every cell, let's say several million mutations every day. And our repair capacities are so great that we're repairing several million every day in our cells that it happens, it's repaired. It happens, it's repaired. It's so quickly. And maybe, as they say, one mutation survives per day at the end of all these millions of mutations. So basically what is that the field with Muller, and that this is also very interesting. They have a field that wants to be important. And so it's all tied into their field and their radiation geneticists, and they're making sure that their ideas conquer the world. And when this guy comes up with this idea that, well, it's actually not background radiation, guys, it's actually endogenous metabolism, and we're talking, all kinds of genetic damage in terms of double-strand breaks. We're talking everything. It's totally dominated by endogenous metabolism. But we're here today because when damage is induced, the damage is actually very efficiently repaired. It may not be perfect, but it's extremely, unbelievably great. And, just getting 999, 90 out of a million correct. And actually even more than that, systems are really, highly, highly selected for so that we can actually live.
But that's not a good story. This is the 1950s. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki wasn't too far in the past. We're looking at all the survivors. And so just politically, this isn't a nice story to tell. This isn't a nice story to say, oh, humans can survive radiation. It's not as bad as you think.
This is interesting because after the dropping of the bomb, the government of Japan and the United States, working through the National Academy of Sciences, set up these big studies, gigantic studies, lifespan studies, genetic studies, all kinds of other studies, thousands of individuals working on these, still working on them, by the way. And in 1946, this professor from Michigan, James Neal, gets in charge of the birth defects component study. And he's got a PhD in radiation from University of Rochester, where the Manhattan Project radiation studies were done. And is an MD as well. He's a young guy, but he's well trained. He undertakes this study. And so for the first 10 years, they're trying to accumulate lots of data. In 1956, they have the big summary. And to the shock of everybody, he shows that there was no treatment effect that they could measure with 75,000 offspring over 10 years. And so what happened is that they wrote 350-page big summary report. The National Academy has created a big committee called the Biological Effects of Atomic Radiation Committee in 1955-56 to recommend to the country how do we deal with radiation going forward. this genetics panel is a unique panel, and they're looking at it. And Neil's on the panel, and he attempts to give his report to the panel to evaluate. He sent it to Mueller in advance. As it turns out, Mueller stood up at this first meeting, and he said that these negative findings were an illusion and that they should not evaluate this paper. And Mueller was like the big dog in the room. I mean, he's got a Nobel Prize. He's a very domineering person. He very insulting person, actually, in many ways. And they did not evaluate. This National Academy Committee. They decided not to evaluate 10 years of human data. 10 years of human data, and they relied upon fruit flies to guide the national policy.
I mean, that is shocking because even today, people cite what happened to the survivors in Japan and how many birth defects and genetic mutations there were, when in fact the original report does not bear that out. They're referring to fruit fly studies.
I have to tell you that this study by James Neal that Mueller would not let, the group did not review, that study has continued all the way to the present time. And every interim 3 or 4 years, they update what they found. And the last updating, they have never found any significant increase in mutational occurrences, birth defects, and so forth in the offspring of the survivors that were exposed. And I'd have to tell you, over the time, there's been this massive explosion in terms of genetic mechanisms and biomarkers and whatever you want to call them. And in using all the latest and greatest and most sophisticated, and maybe we can come up with more sensitive measures of mutational damage. With all these new developments, they have not found any significant increase.
I would like to ask, though, in this study, there was an increase. Was there an increase in cancer and deaths of the people who were directly exposed to radiation?
Yes, there were.
Okay, but not the offspring.
The offspring, they were studying for genetic effects. And the lifespan study, they're studying it, people who were exposed and studying them their whole life. Now, the first cancers that really came to be were the leukemias. And then after that, then other cancers tended to show up. And it's also interesting, this really drove a lot of concerns because they showed various increases in leukemia. And this was highlighted in papers in the journal Science and elsewhere.
You've hit close to home because I use the Bear Report in my classes. And I guess it's my own fault, blindly trust the Bear Report because it's a National Academies report. It's a group of highly esteemed scientists that have looked through all the data and have put it all together. But now you're telling me it's based on a lie.
It's based on a lie, and it's based upon, and the lies go deeper. There are so many different lies that go on all throughout this process. There's a never-ending string of lies. Goes right, the entire Manhattan Project data was similar.
I feel so naive now. I mean, you've kind of just I'm speechless.
It actually gets, the more you look, the worse it gets. This Mueller, after he was bombarded by all the criticism with this reverse mutation that didn't work, he tried to reinvent himself with looking at total dose versus dose rate in a dissertation over in Edinburgh. And he tried to use this to support his position. And, again, Mueller doesn't publish in the peer review. He publishes a paper in a proceedings that's not peer reviewed. I get the dissertation. I get the comments from the graduate committee and letters between Mueller and his graduates when it's saved and so forth. And one of the interesting things is that they were using radium, and radium releases gamma rays. And they have their control group and their treatment group. Let's put it this way. I know in the Manhattan Project, when you have the control and the treatment group together in your incubators, you have to put a lead shield in between so the gamma rays that pass through don't hit the control group. And they try to estimate the control group exposures and so forth. It's very interesting in that dissertation and the paper, and I've looked every which way you can look. They never mentioned where the incubators were with respect to each other. They never mentioned if they had lead shielding, if in fact they were right next to each other, which is probably what it could have been. In the control group in this Edinburgh study, from my calculation, even with 99% efficiency, if you had a lead shield, the control group would have been exposed to 24 rats. I mean, it was a massively high dose. It wasn't even reported at all. I discovered this, 70 years later, and the field doesn't even bother to have ever looked at it before.
This is sloppy science. All around, it's sloppy science. And what I want to ask, though, is I think we can agree it's bad science, but what are the ramifications? Because if this was just some, academic exercise, then there's no ramifications to it. It's just a bunch of academics squabbling over something. But this matters. Explain to us why it matters. Like, how is this impacting us as the general public?
Well, why it matters to me in my job is I've done a lot with, let's say, the U.S. EPA over the years. My whole career is tied into government regulation, drinking water standards, air quality standards, occupational standards, you name it, and cleanup standards, for waste sites and things of that nature, and many other things, actually. The biggest issue is really the nature of carcinogens and how they work. And it's the most expensive, and we tend to deal with risks that are very low risks. And this is driven by modeling. It's driven by this LNT model that Muller really formulated back in 1930 and working with people in 1935 and passed it on. And that became the driver. And what that really does is that it's estimating to people what they think the risks are, and therefore that gets fit into a risk management plan and how much money you'll allocate for cleaning up different sites or making standards more strict because you want to achieve safety. What these standards are doing, in my opinion, is that they're overestimating the risks by many orders of magnitude. And therefore that gets translated into gigantic amounts of money that's spent, but also money that should be spent on other matters. If you're going to be spending the same amount of money within society, you might want to spend it on something that's real rather than something that's ephemeral. And this plays out in lawsuits and other things. You have these cases that are, people think that they are based upon the linear modeling, that there's a cancer risk at such and such an exposure. And it's all based upon a linear model that has its historical foundation in many errors, as also in scientific misconduct. I can tell you that one of the members on that National Academy Committee, William Russell, he in 1956 started a very big study at Oak Ridge, and it was looking at X-rays and cancer in the next generation. And they actually found no effects. They found no effects on longevity, no effects on cancer. And it was a very large study. And he suppressed the data. Never published it, right? Never published it. Now that was in 1959, the study ended. He was a relatively young man at the time. 35 years later, 1993, around that time period, big lawsuit was taking place in England. And one of his colleagues, who was the former director of the U.S. National Cancer Institute, Arthur Upton, he's hired as a consultant to this case. He knows about the data that has been suppressed. He calls up William Russell at Oak Ridge and says, we need to publish that data that we've sat on for 35 years so I can win this lawsuit over in England. And so he flies out with the English people over to Oak Ridge, and they reconstitute the data. They publish it in the Journal of Mutation Research in 1993. It's submitted to the journal on the very day that Art Upton first testifies at the case over in England. It was suppressed the whole time. And the reason why Russell hid the data for 35 years in his own writing was he didn't think society could handle it.
I mean, what's the benefit of keeping the public scared of radiation? Because that's what it seems that the government or scientists, I don't know who is trying to keep the public opinion, kind of terrified of radiation.
Well, actually, part of it is tied into massive self-interest. Researchers such as myself, we live off of grants. We live off of basically the federal government and maybe other sponsors keeping us alive. And so if you can, in fact, I have correspondence of the BEAR committee members saying it's okay to stretch a point and to keep the public agitated because it brings more money into our coffers. And you can take a look at at research that goes on within, I'd say, the EPA and other groups. They keep their jobs, they stay in business because they hype risks. They absolutely hype risks. When you take a look at academics who write grant proposals, the next crisis is an opportunity for a researcher. I benefit from that. I mean, I'm criticizing it, but I've benefited from that. And that's part of the mindset. It's massive academic self-interest, and it's also massive regulatory self-interest to keep your jobs and keep your agency expanding. It's job security.
I'm so disillusioned, Ed. I'm so disillusioned. You've just shattered my field and my life. I mean, I've been trying to get people to not be scared of radiation, and you're saying it's in my best interest to keep people scared of radiation. I'm doing it all wrong. I should be asking for money instead of trying to get people comfortable with radiation.
That's right. 99% of the other academics, that's exactly what they do. And the whole issue on, when you look at any area that happens, and without denying that different things cause risks, but there's the massive hyping of risks. That's really what it is, whether it's climate change, which is a big deal today, whether it's lead, whether it's methyl mercury, whether it's endocrine disruption. You can take a look at all of these areas. I wouldn't deny that there are concerns with all of them, legitimate concerns with all of them. But when you really take a look, the hype is massive and excessive, and it's based largely on self-interest. See, the thing of it is, it's self-interest by those who hold themselves as in a morally superior position. But when you really go back and you take a look at the history of radiation genetics by all these multiple Nobel Prize winners, and all these people have other great awards named after them, when you really take a look at it, it was, I'm not denying that they weren't very bright and didn't make great accomplishments and so forth, but it was largely driven by massive self-interest. And there was a lot of dishonesty, deliberate dishonesty, to perpetuate the importance of their area. And it's so easy to get a politician to tie into this, because then you can demonize the other side really easily. It happens all the time.
My final question to you is, if we get rid of the LNT, what do we replace it with? Because somehow we have to assess risk in public policy. So if we're assessing risk in public policy, how do we replace LNT? How do we assess risk to the public?
I would refer people to the Health Physics Society documentary. It's a 22-episode documentary that I was interviewed for the whole time. And on that last, the 22nd one, they asked me a similar sort of a question. And my answer was that I believe that the risk should be assessed, driven by scientists who are really trained in evolution, who understand the idea of adaptive mechanisms, how organisms survive and adapt and deal with all kinds of chemical, physical threats, and who understand how the quantitative aspects of dose responses within that framework. What we have had is we have had committees driven by public health, I'm going to say precautionary principle driven epidemiologists that only can estimate risk down to a certain relatively high level, given the limitations of epidemiology. They make guesstimates which are not based upon underlying understandings of adaptive mechanisms. And my view is, I'm a hormesis guy, and I think that the basic dose response is biphasic. And that really will change the equation tremendously in terms of how you estimate risk. But I think that what we need to do is to bring the different groups together and to have a much more honest evaluation of the scientific basis that we have, so that it's not driven by a precautionary principle, but you have an evolutionary science-based precautionary principle. So that it really changes the equation in terms of how risk could be looked at. But what you have is all kinds of fears, and they play on fears.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to Ed for taking time out to speak with me. He is continuing to publish papers on this subject, and I will link to some of them on our webpage, mynuclearlife.com. On our webpage, you can also find a variety of ways to support our podcast. You can also help us by leaving us a rating or review wherever you are listening. Until next time, I'm Shelley Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.